Good morning and welcome to Princeton University's Alumni-Faculty Forum, Civil Society and the Attack on Journalism. This panel discussion will begin momentarily. After the webinar, there will be a short 1-minute video on Princeton's Forward Fest. Thank you for your attention.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us today for what I hope will be an amazing and wonderful discussion about this industry that we all love so much, an industry that is evolving, that requires a lot of thought and answers as we move forward into this multi-platform future where journalism is defined differently than it was 15, 20, 30, 40 years ago. And so we have an esteemed panel today, happens to be of all women. This was just accidental, but we're gonna run with it because these folks have a lot to say. They have diverse backgrounds, or diverse ages, and so there's a lot of experience at this table. The people who are gonna be discussing these issues are your alumni that you have voted. You want to hear from them, so they're going to share their great stories, their thought as we move forward in this discussion today. So I just want to set a little framing around it. So today's discussion is about civil society and attack on journalism. As we've seen in the news this week, there's a lot that's under attack. Reporters, their the how we do our work, the material that we collect. And it's not just about reputation risk. It's also about life and your mental health. But, you know, in some situations, reporters risk their lives for this kind of work. And so we're going to discuss the current landscape of journalism, the future landscape, the threats to journalism and the industry and to reporters themselves. And then we're going to talk about what's next. You know, can we have some discussions about what that's going to look like in the future? So we're going to start with this wonderful panel, and in a second, I'm going to ask each of them to talk for about a minute or two about why they got in this industry, and then we're going to dive into some deeper questions. But just to start, we have Melanie Laughton, 1976. She's an anchor and reporter at KTRK TV, a Disney ABC affiliate in Houston, and she has interviewed a wide range of notables, too many to list, but I'll just say 3 presidents, Maya Angelou, Ta-Nehisi Coates, John Lewis, and the list goes on. So we're very excited to have her today. Maria Ressa, a journalist in Asia for 35 years. She's co-founder of Rappler, the top digital-only news site that is leading the fight for press freedoms in the Philippines. And she has endured constant political harassment and pressure under the government there and has been forced to bail 10 times just to stay free. Laura Coates, a CNN anchor and senior legal analyst. She's got her own talk show on Sirius XM Talk, and she's a native of St. Paul, Minnesota, and graduated from the Woodrow Wilson School of Public International Affairs. She has served as a trial attorney in the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice under both the Bush and Obama administrations, and she specializes in the enforcement of voting rights. Natalie Kitroeff is a foreign correspondent at the New York Times based in Mexico City, and she's worked on a series of stories. She's worked at the LA Times, she's worked on opinion pieces, but most recently she's worked on a series of investigations on pregnancy discrimination in the workplace and was part of a team of reporters that covered the Boeing 737 MAX crashes. And then finally, we have Sarah Qari. She's a producer at the Peabody Award-winning podcast and radio show Radiolab at New York Public Radio, and she reports and produces stories with a special interest in the Supreme Court, democracy, and politics. So welcome everyone to this panel today, and I'm very excited. We have so many things to get to that I don't even know how we're going to do that in this short period of time. We'll also have questions that are being submitted via the Q&A. So throughout the discussion, we're not just going to wait to the end. I'll see your questions and I will pose them to the panelists as well. So let's get started. So if each panelist can start, just a minute or two, talk about how you got into this industry and what we need to know about you. And Natalie, I will start with you.
Oh, wow. Okay, well, I have a good Princeton story, which is that I got into this industry because a Princeton grad who was also teaching a journalism course sort of forced me to. And when I graduated, pushed me to apply for a job as an assistant with Nick Kristof at the Times, at the New York Times. And I never left journalism. I couldn't get hired at the Times then, but I realized through that work that this was a way to bring sort of to bear everything that you kind of want to see in terms of the truth and the facts in a completely, hopefully objective way every day. So yeah, I went to Bloomberg, I went to the LA Times, and then I went back to the New York Times. And for the last year, I've been in Mexico working as a foreign correspondent, covering Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean.
Excellent, thank you. Sarah.
Hi, everybody. I'm Sarah. I was Princeton class of 2016. At Princeton, I studied anthropology, and I think that's sort of kind of why I got into journalism as well. Like the ethos of the department was very like, if you want to study social issues, if you want to talk about them, the place where that story is happening is with the people that experience it. And I think that is something that really drew me to journalism and made me want to have those conversations in a public forum rather than in academia. And yeah, at the time I was listening to a lot of podcasts, and it's been a really interesting, like really a field that's grown a lot in even just the last 5 years. And it's been really interesting to learn how to do radio storytelling and what journalism even really means in this whole sort of emerging field. So that's me.
Thank you. Laura, we'll go to you next.
Well, I'm excited to be here, everyone. I'm so sad that I'm missing our 20th in person, but I'm glad I'm with all of you, and what a panel. I got to tell you, I happened upon journalism. It was never part of my plan. My thesis advisor, and I had several professors tell me to go into journalism, and I ignored them all. And I said, no, I'm going to be a lawyer because that's, of course, what I wanted to do. And then I practiced law, and I was a federal prosecutor, and I was learning so much at the intersection of all things that I was really interested in, from voting rights to criminal justice to police reform to social issues. And it just ran the gamut. But being within the Department of Justice, I was not able to speak about the stories that needed to be shared, about trying to inform, trying to illuminate issues that really mattered, helping people to understand. And so I came at it in the lens of a storyteller and trying to make sure that I was a conduit of the information I was learning and to inform. And really, I looked at it as making the things that were so important digestible and easily accessible, and not having a lot of the areas I was in be in this sort of intellectual elitism. I wanted everyone to be able to understand and then help our nation to progress. So I took some leaps of faith, and here is where I landed, and I've just loved what I'm doing. And it's been sort of a meandering path, but it's been one that has not at all allowed me to rest on my laurels, which is a good thing. So I'm excited.
Thank you. Maria, we'll go to you next.
I was pre-med in college, and I did do a senior thesis that was a creative thesis. I wrote a play, and then I took a year because I couldn't quite go to medical school yet. It's a good thing I didn't. I landed in the Philippines in 1986 on a fellowship, and I just never left. I opened the Manila bureau, and then I went on to open the Jakarta bureau of CNN. Stayed there for 20 years, and then I looked for home. And I wound up here in the Philippines and led the largest news group. I think for me, it was always left brain, right brain. I think the second thing throughout is tech, how technology has shifted. You know, I grew up at a time when we were reporting with notebooks, and then the cell phones that were suitcase size, and then Tocos, video phones, satellite technology, and onto social media. And then I think the last part that's important is in the last 5 years, I've come under personal attack for doing journalism. So I've decided that when it is a battle for facts, which is where we are today, journalism becomes activism. So just to throw it to my co-panelists.
Excellent. So with that one, let's get started, because it feels like the definition of what journalism is, you know, I feel like 20 years ago, and maybe I was just being delusional, I felt like there was a clear definition of what journalism was. Everybody was doing the same thing, your print or your broadcast. You know, you didn't have all this online, you didn't have podcasts and, you know, streaming and radio. You had radio also, but it's like it's changed so much, even within the last year, in terms of how you perform journalism with the pandemic, and how do you get audio if you're on a podcast, if you're not allowed to go in the field. So let me start with this broad stroke of how is journalism actually defined today? And please make a distinction between how it's defined and whether you think it should be defined differently. Sarah, you're into podcasting and all things like that. Let's start with you.
Sure. Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think it's sort of the trajectory you're describing sort of, I feel like, maps onto my adulthood in an interesting way, where I just feel like, you know, throughout college and post-college, like I've seen journalism become this increasingly, like, tech companies use the word like democratize, like as if like that's sort of what they're allowing to happen to information. Like, you know, people can take the story into their own hands and like tell their own story. And there's an element to that I think is really exciting. That's like, oh, you know, when you have a crisis somewhere in the world, the people that are experiencing it are the ones that are able to kind of do the storytelling about themselves and sharing information about their experience. And then, you know, even as it expands to journalists, I think it's like been kind of exciting to see that, you know, the barrier to entry in a field that has been so historically, you know, like gate kept, you know, by white men essentially, that's been lowered, and a lot of new people have been allowed in the door. But at the same time, I think then that raises a lot of questions about like, okay, well, what expertise do you have to be a journalist? Like, can you just get online and like put up a podcast about something you think is true? And like, what do you have to say? What are the kinds of things that you have to do to like show your work and like show that you've done the fact checking and everything like that? So it to me, it feels like a very double-edged sword in a way.
No, that's great. And before, I just realized I skipped a panelist. There's so many boxes on my screen right now, so I apologize to Melanie. Can you please also introduce yourself and tell us why you got into this field?
Oh my goodness, listen, my feelings are not hurt. We've got a lot to talk about. I'll just say really quickly, I didn't know what I wanted to do even while I was at Princeton, but I knew I liked to read, I liked to write, and I was nosy. So I figured there had to be a career that fit all of those things together. And I was lucky enough to do radio at Princeton. I worked with the Princetonian for a few minutes, but radio really intrigued me more at WPRB. And then when I got back home to Houston, which is where I've lived most of my adult life, I discovered television. I had an internship in TV, and I thought, oh my goodness, this sort of puts everything I like together, and I don't have to describe it, I can just show it. I can talk about it as it happens. And I'm sure Laura could certainly relate to that as well as the rest of you. But so mine was not a very disciplined jump to journalism. It was just a lot of luck as it turned out. So that's all I'll say about that. But thank you very much.
Has the pandemic, Melanie, changed how you do your job?
Well, it certainly changed how all of us did our job because we were kind of accustomed. I'm in a traditional newsroom at an owned and operated station in Houston. And so we're used to being in a big newsroom. We're all sitting in our little cubicles and we're shouting across the room as things happen or having editorial meetings. Well, with COVID, everything shut down. Most of our crews were either sent home to do everything remotely, or there was one photographer, one reporter assigned to travel around together. They didn't work with anybody else. Many of the anchors worked from home. I was one of those. And when you walked into our newsroom, you saw it was deserted. You saw a couple of producers, a couple of anchors, and that was it. And that went on for a good period of time. As we can all see on television, interviews these days are done by Zoom, the vast majority of them. I think we're gradually getting back to a little bit more personal connection, certainly now that we are losing our mask. But our company has taken its time reintroducing all of us back into the newsroom. I happen to work for a large corporation for Disney, but I imagine all of newsrooms around the country are in the same fix.
And obviously at the same time, at least here in the States, we have this transition from one administration where it was like the news cycle was relentless. You felt like you couldn't sleep, especially on a Friday. You know, it's not the downtime. It's like if somebody's going to get fired from the administration, it's going to happen on a Friday, or there's going to be some crazy news event on the weekend. And now things have completely changed, not a little, a lot. And really, you know, reporters have to be more intentional about what am I writing about, and writing about policy in ways that maybe you wrote more about the spot news. You know, how has that changed along with the pandemic for the work that you do? How, you know, has it become harder? Has it become more, I told somebody it's more exciting as an investigative reporter to me because I'm like, wow, I can actually focus on policy and how people are impacted. But how has that impacted your work? And I'll just kind of toss it out to anybody.
Well, I'll chime in. I mean, you're absolutely right about the way in which for over the period of at least 4 years, the news wrote itself in some respects. There was not lulls or downtime. There was always going to be a story that was going to have monumental consequences. And it didn't really have an opportunity for people to do a lot of in-depth reporting on issues that were continuing to happen alongside of what was happening in Washington, DC, and for political reasons. And those deep dives that were essential to not only help people to address issues and resolve them, but understand what was happening. And a lot of the things that normally would have been deep dive and things people could hear about became reduced to anecdotes because the news cycle just did not allow people to understand that it wasn't just an anecdote. These were things that were happening. It was pervasive. I'm talking a lot about issues in terms of police excessive force cases and what was happening in voter suppression and a lot of different areas. And so with the changing administration, but also with the changing way people approached reporting and not having to necessarily chase physically stories, it allowed people to have an opportunity to take a step back and get the landscape of what was really going on. And the pandemic, I always found, I want to hear from you all, I found that the pandemic was very successful and continues to be at capitalizing and exploiting on existing inequities. It didn't create them, but just seeing things in terms of health disparities, geographical inequities, things about what was going on and who was considered essential in our labor force and who was not, who was essentially able to be ignored, the prison population, what was going on. There were real choices being made that the pandemic was exploiting. And journalism, I think, is at a very interesting time of being able to, you know, illuminate those areas, to go much deeper. And it's driving not only the conversations, but it's driving legislation as well. And so it's a very interesting place to be.
Maria and Sarah, I see you nodding your head. Let me get you in here on that. Maria first.
Yeah, I mean, so first, I think, it's an existential moment on so many levels. The coronavirus only stripped away the noise a little bit and showed us, number one, journalism itself, our business model died, crumbled. And the very same reasons for that, i.e. technology and the platforms, are also the very same reasons why we are being attacked, right? Why, sorry, that's really people, but the funnel that comes at you, the amount of toxicity, the questioning of credibility. And then I think that then you put together, as Laura said, kind of, so where do we focus? Well, it's been many, many years, at least a decade, where frankly, the news cycle has spun so out of control that we have atomized meaning, and social media has only allowed that to get faster during this time. And then the third point I'll add to this is that, at the start of the lockdown in March last year, I wrote a piece for Time where I just said, we can't let the virus infect our democracy. And in so many countries around the world, it has. In the Philippines, what you've seen is that our government has essentially used this time period when we are under a lockdown to ramp up borrowing and to consolidate power. So I'm sure Mexico, I mean, we've all, countries with digital authoritarians have moved, they've used the digital realm to consolidate power, and journalists are under greater stress, greater attack, even as the mission of journalism has become more important.
Sarah, let me get you in here too, because I see you aggressively nodding on this.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I was just Laura's point about the pandemic sort of deepening the inequalities that already existed just really resonated with me, and sort of what Maria's saying as well. And I almost like I hate to do this, but the journalist in me is now like, I just really want to hear from Natalie about how the pandemic has affected things in journalism in Mexico.
She's been out there quietly waiting. Yes, I want to hear from you, Natalie, too.
Well, I don't know if it's the pandemic or, we've had in Mexico, there's a relatively new president who has in many ways sort of taken control of the media narrative in a way that sort of, if what Twitter is to Donald Trump, a morning news conference, a 3-hour often morning news conference is to Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who, and I think because of the pandemic, because everybody is inside and because we're so dependent on what the government allows us to do, how much space we have to operate in the world, I mean, there are even more eyes on, this morning news conference. And the president is very, very sharp in terms of how he uses this space and time. He is in many ways a political genius. And he has used it increasingly to attack the messenger here in Mexico, and that's often the media. And so what that means in a country where, which is almost, in many years, it's the deadliest country for journalists. It is for sure a dangerous place to practice, not for people like me. I work at the New York Times, not for many of the people, honestly, in Mexico City, but there are journalists all over this country who work in narco-dominated areas and states where they're constantly threatened. These are the people who die, right, for doing their work, for bringing the truth to the page. And the example that he set in these morning news conferences is to have lists of columnists and journalists to call people out by name. He's done this with us. He's put our stories up on a big screen and had our names there and talked about how the New York Times has no ethics and is not credible. And this doesn't affect me the way that it affects people who get killed, right? I think the more pervasive effect of a president who has dominated the digital airwaves during the pandemic and in general has been that it has legitimized some of the sort of other attacks that you see on journalists across this country that are much more dangerous. It's legitimized from the very top of the power structures of this country the idea that journalism is worthless, lies, for people who are motivated, who are paid by, shadowy rich people And that kind of environment achieves the purpose of sowing just enough doubt that you, as a political leader, can operate in an environment where the truth is not really secure, where the people who are trying to report the facts are not the ones who own what the facts are. You can set the agenda for what the facts are. I think, I really resist every comparison to what we experienced under the Trump administration in terms of the attacks on the media, but there are obviously some similarities there. And I'm sure that our panelists, I'm sure in every part of the world we've seen examples like this. So, Donald Trump is not the first or the last to, spearhead a model like this. But I do think it was the first time where the US, in a really complete way, experienced what was a new environment in terms of how we think about the credibility of the media.
Natalie, let me ask you this question. Obviously you mentioned there are some protections you have with the New York Times, and it's a different experience for you than maybe some of the local journalists there. As you talk to your colleagues, what is their experience? At the end of the day, we're all human and going through a very difficult time with the coronavirus, but also having that personal attack. What is it like to see your story and your name up there? What are you hearing from your colleagues, and what were you thinking the first time you saw this?
Well, for me, again, I would just say that I am, lucky, and I really am, when I talk to Mexican colleagues who, and even folks who are just going to these press conferences, right, to report on them, they're there with, the people that also get let in alongside them are like pro-regime YouTuber, pro-administration YouTubers who often will criticize them on their morning YouTube right before they go into the press conference, or in one case, call for their murder, So these folks who are doing the thankless work of waking up at 4 a.m. to go cover this conference, that starts really early in the morning, they have to line up, it makes a thankless job even harder. And so, they face attacks online, they face troll armies, they face people putting their personal pictures online, digging through, their social media accounts and putting them on blast in a way that makes it really difficult for them to wake up every single morning and just do their job. So I think that's the most fundamental thing. Like, we at the Times have the resources where, we can withstand this kind of thing. But of course, to answer your question, when the president put one of our stories about a gubernatorial candidate who has been accused by rape, and we, had an interview with one of the women who accused him of rape, and we, wrote a pretty tough story about how this candidate that the president was supporting had been accused of rape. And he just went through how it was all lies, and the New York Times was paid for by all of these, rich, and we were doing the kind of bidding of the global elite. The effect that it has is that you are less trusted by a group of people that really follow what the president says here. And these aren't stupid people. These are, this guy comes from the left. So a lot of academics who really have been excited about the left coming to power in Mexico hear what he says and they kind of believe him. And when you see them, in social settings, they sort of say, well, what has happened really to the New York Times? All you guys do is publish lies. And I'm sure we've all experienced this, but of course that's extremely frustrating because I'm really proud of the work that we do. And it's really hard to get a story about a gubernatorial candidate accused of rape into the New York Times on the front page. We have to do a lot of work to make that happen. And then to see that essentially people who have heard this message just don't believe any of it. It's tough. It's not a death threat, but it is not also what you imagine when you put together a story like that.
There, like you said, there's death threats that are happening. People are getting murdered. But then there's also this attack on, the integrity of your work. And I just want to talk about that a little bit. People talked about during the Trump administration, but oh no, we're in a Biden administration now. And so I think it was a bit of a surprise recently when it was announced that the Justice Department had actually been able to get the records of reporters without their knowledge, without the knowledge from their publications. and just kind of take that information. You know, for reporters, we hold tight to our sources. And so Laura, I want to get you in here to talk about this. You have experience, you've worked with the Justice Department. You know, can you first walk through, for people who are unfamiliar with what's happening, what happened this week, and then kind of give your opinion about that?
Sure. Well, generally speaking, the ideas of, and I want to echo what Natalie's saying, and just the frustration of what it's like when people literally and figuratively are killing the messenger of information. The whole role of the press and journalism is to answer the question, what's happening or what happened to the people who need to have the information to understand the world around them and to make decisions about whether they truly are represented by the people they have put in office, especially in the United States of America. And so the frustrations about having the deflection try to focus on the person who's providing the information as a way to not address what the underlying information is part of a bigger problem. And one of the things we saw this week, and we're learning for the second time in as many weeks, the idea of the Justice Department under the prior administration actually trying to secretly get, not unbeknownst to the courts, through the legal means of getting access to journalists' personal, professional email, cell phone, and telephone records, purportedly an attempt to get to the bottom of who they perceived as leaking classified information. And there's a lot of doubt whether that's a pretextual reason, whether that's actually what was going on. But the idea of having these journalists not even be aware it's happening, and you're talking about what they're trying to provide is a service to the American people in terms of what the information is. And these are over issues of national security, which affects us all. And really in an increasingly global environment, the national security of the United States of America impacts the entire world. We're in a bit of a Pangea. So just to give background on what's happening, but when I look at this and the difficulty that so many have is, while presidents change, the institutions that they appoint people to lead are continuing. I myself was a career prosecutor in the Department of Justice. So I was not serving a particular president. I was not hired by a particular president. I wasn't appointed. We were called career prosecutors. And that's the overwhelming number of career federal employees who go on and continue irrespective of who is the president of the United States. And but the problem with that is when you've got points in time in American history where the trust towards the institutions is so fundamentally eroded, it makes the job of those career prosecutors who have to make sure that people trust and believe in them and that they are serving as public servants. If you've got political discussions and political conduct that is undermining the thought that these agencies are supposed to be apolitical, not only do journalists have a difficult time trying to convey the information, but the information coming out of these sources, number one, or the agencies themselves have this almost Herculean efforts in trying to preserve their integrity in front of a judge, in front of the court of public opinion. And so it just makes it fundamentally harder when you have apolitical agencies who have to not only address the underlying issues that they're supposed to be serving, but now they have to fight against the perception that they only serve a particular political group. And if that group is not in power, they will not help, they will only harm. And that has been, I think, one of the most difficult things as somebody who was a public servant to now see. When you see attacks on the Capitol, it's about a larger issue. It's about not trusting a whole system of government that is supposed to be of, for, and by the people. And those with the loudest microphones, the biggest platforms, rather than using their powers for good, are using it to perpetuate things that will hurt us all in the end.
What was your, Laura, what was your first reaction when you saw the news? But then also, what does this mean for both the future of journalism for reporters who have, they found this out after the fact. This information, their phone records, their personal phone records, it was already acquired. What does this mean for the future of journalism and reporters who just say, I don't want to do this anymore, or either they dig in further? Like, what's going to happen? What's the chilling effect?
Well, I think there are those two paths. One is the chilling effect, and one is the path of being so resolved to say, this is exactly why I must push forward. And I think overwhelmingly you have journalists who are looking at this because of frankly, there's a lot of solidarity in the field and camaraderie when it's what has been very positive to see, although not universal, very positive to see is when one journalist gets attacked, you almost have this impression of you're going against the entire family, right? It's the idea of no matter what issues you may have individually, if you have siblings out there, you can understand this issue. You may fight amongst yourselves, you may be irritated amongst yourselves, but when somebody picks on one of you, the whole family gets involved and everyone's annoyed enough to say, let's join together. So when you see other journalists saying, I'm coming to support this person, and I stand in solidarity with this, because not only are you learning about it after the fact, I believe that this was the case, at least one of my colleagues, that the information that was gleaned was from 3 years ago. And so you have all of the information, how long have they had access to, and wondering whether the judiciary could be questioned in terms of being complicit. So you've got these, your spine essentially comes out of your back on these issues. But I think the people are knowledgeable enough to understand that if the goal is to chill the speech, that people have got to be all the more resolved to dig in their heels and speak even louder. Because if someone's telling you there's nothing to see here, folks, as Melanie was talking about, that instinctive nosiness, she called it, that's when journalism works best, when what they don't want you to see is what you put the magnifying glass on and dare them to take it away.
So let me open this question up to the rest of the group. Just, what was your reaction when you saw that? And did it have the chilling effect, or did you, are we going to see more of this in the future? What was everybody's reaction?
This is so funny. This is a panel of women. We're very respectful to each other. I'm going to jump in only because I think that the problem, that's only the first of your problem. And this sounds really, I hope it doesn't sound patronizing. It's going to get a lot worse because of technology, right? And I think you are going to have to fight the same way that we've had to fight. I mean, look, I walk outside, I have to wear a bulletproof vest. I know that our conversations are probably monitored. It's going to get worse. And part of the reason that that's going to get worse is because journalists who are supposed to hold power to account have lost our gatekeeping powers. We're no longer in charge of the public sphere, but we kind of have vestigial limbs. We're still held responsible for it. News managers beat themselves up talking about trust. Laura talked about trust, right? Another Princeton alum in his 100 years, George Schultz said that, and I'm going to paraphrase him, he said, without trust, nothing is possible. With trust, everything is possible. And the problem right now is that the journalists who used to keep the integrity of facts so we could have trust have been pushed aside, and the new gatekeepers, technology, has essentially abdicated responsibility. So I'll go one step further to say that our biggest problem is not journalism as much as it is the technology that delivers the journalism, right? And I'm sorry, I sound like a broken record. I'll go to social media and how it has become a behavior modification system that with these micro-targeting tools has essentially distilled us to become Pavlov's dogs. And these experiments are happening in real time. When you get something here and you click or you don't click, it's a perpetual hype machine. And the consequences have been disastrous. These are American social media platforms, right? Facebook is the world's largest distributor of news. And yet the studies show that lies laced with anger and hate spread faster and further than facts. Facts are boring. We spend our careers learning how to make them interesting, but the social media platform that delivers those facts to you are biased against facts, and they're biased against journalists. Conflate that with power, right? So at least in my country, that's how I saw democracy getting crumbling. It was exponential attacks on social media coming up. The phrase for it is information operations. Russia targeted the United States starting in 2014, but 2016 was the one where you guys talked about it. Black Lives Matter got pounded on both sides, right? So it's, I guess I'm saying we have bigger problems. And I don't mean to say that looking at our phone records are bad. Are not bad. Of course it is, and you should fight for the rights, but I think we should be demanding that aside from government, that private companies should not be taking our personal data and actually making it available to anyone at the highest price.
Melanie, let me pull you into this because you've covered multiple administrations. You've seen a lot from different vantage points. What was your reaction to this, and how, what are your thoughts about how this is going to impact the future of journalism?
Well, I have to say, I wasn't shocked by any stretch of the imagination. Anybody who believes we have privacy, whether as journalists or citizens anymore, is probably fooling themselves. And I think Maria nailed it when she talked about the technology now that exposes all of us way more than we perhaps are comfortable with. But I also think that just as Laura talked about the pandemic really exposing so many things, so many inequities, so many communities and their needs that perhaps were not visible there before. I think in a lot of ways, the prior administration exposed so much in terms of what's going on underneath the surface. We all sort of deluded ourselves into thinking we could carry our spear into battle and it was a fair fight, when in fact, it's never really been a fair fight. We're just able to see it a lot more clearly. And I know that at least one of the questions that's popped up in chat has to do with the blurring of the lines in terms of journalism. And so it used to be when we had, 3 or 4 major networks way back in the dark ages, that everybody was kind of on the same side. We were all pushing for the same truths and trying to make sure that we covered in a fair and objective way, even if it wasn't always individually fair and objective. And this person was asking about agencies now that have a political agenda. And so they've taken that distrust by the public that much further because, I saw it on television, I read it on social media. So therefore it must be true. And you guys are the ones that are lying. You are the ones that are, fake news. So I suppose bringing it all kind of full circle, I wasn't surprised. Perhaps I should have been, but I think we all live with the reality now that there's a great deal more exposed in this world than there was before now. And I know we are also going to talk at some point about what makes a journalist these days. And I think that has, if perhaps possible, further blurred everything, because anybody can be a journalist now. You've got a cell phone, you've got questions, you can, pop up at a press conference and suddenly, we're all reporters and yet and still there is no clarity as to who's actually doing the work and who's just sort of coming in and asking a question that comports with their own opinions or their own feelings. So that's another topic, but certainly one that I think at some point we may want to talk about.
Oh, we're for sure going to talk about that because I mean, Natalie mentioned it with the YouTuber being there. Also, we saw it with the Black Lives Matter movement, where you had traditional media going in and to different places in the protests, but you had people who were in the community who were bloggers who had the connections and the intel. But we are going to get into that in the next.
And Kimbriell, the other thing is, in some ways, many of the more traditional news agencies kind of elevate those citizen journalists to a higher level because we use their video, we take in their information. And so once again, it's kind of hard to tell who's where and who's doing what. Sorry.
So let's take just to pivot, because I have so much I want to talk about. And I wanted to hear Natalie, but I'm going to move on because I feel like the foreign press and the perspective around this issue of, we're all grasping our pearls like, oh, somebody took our phone records, and the foreign press is probably looking at us like, We've been there, done that, it's gonna get worse. I feel like Princeton, there's a whole other series to probably be done on this, but let's pivot to also another interesting issue, which is like who gets to tell the stories, what Melanie, you just said. And we're gonna talk later about who gets to tell it and who defines it. But let's talk about, the recent issue of this reporter at the AP. Just happened this week. They are no longer employed. The information is, trickling out. But as far as we know is that this person in college, that they were fired, and that when they were in college, that they had some pro-Palestinian activism in college. But now they are working in an industry, and that there was they don't understand why they were fired, but it's tied to that based off of, conservative attention and circulating her social media posts. And we're seeing this increasingly, with Nicole Hannah-Jones this week being denied tenure for this position, this New York Times reporter, Pulitzer Prize winner, MacArthur Genius Grant, started Foundation for Training, has been very vocal and outspoken around diversity and inclusion, and being denied tenure. And so let's talk about that, both from the gender perspective, the diversity perspective, the perspective of people and their past and how it's being used against them to basically silence journalists. When you saw that about the AP reporter this week, what was your thoughts, and how is that going to impact journalism going forward if what reporters have done in their past, whether in college or elsewhere, is going to potentially cause you to lose your job? Did anyone, Natalie, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think one of the issues that is up for debate right now is, are journalists that aren't opinion journalists are journalists allowed to have ever expressed an opinion about anything at any point in their lives? And I mean, the kid was in college, I mean, think about all of our time at Princeton, if we're not allowing people to explore ideas in a public forum, and to not get punished for those ideas later, it was not clear to me in the AP issue that this young reporter had done anything during her time as an AP journalist to warrant any kind of extra scrutiny. Also, just to be clear, she was covering Arizona politics, she's covering the facts of what's happening on the ground in Arizona. She was expressing opinions about, as a student and a Jew, she was expressing opinions about the Palestinian and Israeli conflict in college. I mean, these things are not, there was no clear relationship. And also this was kind of many years ago. And so I think the question is, obviously you can see where I come down on this. I feel like we're human beings, you know what I mean? I mean, she was in college. I think, if in this case, if I'm the reporter that this has happened to, I would hope that my editors and my mentors would take me aside and say, look, this is the social media policy. This is the kind of scrutiny you will come under, and which it happens to us at the New York Times all the time. It doesn't matter if you're covering Arizona politics. You're at the AP. If you as an AP journalist tweet anything about your, past or your activism in the past, that is going to reflect on our colleagues that are doing work in Gaza. And that's a lesson that we all should be learning. I mean, do you punish her? Do you fire her? I don't know. I'm interested in what the other panelists think.
Sarah, do you have some thoughts on that? What was your reaction?
Yeah, I mean, it does honestly, yeah, it really concerns me. I think the element of it that Natalie's talking about is like, it's not just that you as a journalist are expected not to have an opinion about anything ever. It's like you were never in the past, you should have never had an opinion in your past either. And I think that the time aspect of it, like the fact that she now is working as a journalist, and the thing that's at issue is like something that she'd done in college. I think that is something that's really concerning, and it is tricky, because it's like we as journalists are trying to cultivate trust by, you know, increasingly disclosing our sort of perspective. I mean, this is something that at Radiolab we try to do all the time, is like, you know, when I'm coming to a story with a certain set of experiences, I'm trying to tell my listeners that, so that they can factor that in as they will. But then I think the unreasonable expectation that comes out of that is that, like, you know, like my entire person is under scrutiny. Like, I just thought it was really frustrating, for example, last summer, where you know, at New York Public Radio, like, we sort of had to, a lot of us felt that we even had to hesitate and wait for express permission from our, you know, our news outlet to say Black Lives Matter, like that, you know, because then when you start sort of making these lines vague of like what opinions are okay and what are not okay, it just every type of opinion then gets called into question, even one that's not expressly political but has been politicized, I guess. But
go ahead.
oh, sorry. Yeah, but I guess the thing that I you know, even though I find it frustrating that journalists can't have opinions about the things that they're not covering, I think I do worry about it in the context of, you know, we're talking a lot about trust. And I think trust, you know, cultivating trust with your audience is one thing, but I think the place where I almost worry about it more, and where even I worry about like surveillance of journalists more, is in the context of cultivating trust with sources. Like, you know, it's sort of like what Natalie was saying earlier, is like even the suggestion of doubt is enough. And so, you know, I think that in these moments where journalists' integrity and their bias is called into question, I worry a lot more in terms of like sources feeling comfortable coming forth with their stories and entrusting the journalist to tell them fairly.
Let's talk about how this is going to impact the future also, because what you have also is, you know, I mean, like you mentioned, the Black Lives Matter movement. Right now, you have a bunch of students in college and they're part of the protest, right? There are people who are going to be future journalists. Is this going to be used against them in the future? What are we really saying? And it goes back to this whole conversation that has been bubbling up in the last couple of years about objectivity and who gets to define objectivity as a journalist. So anyone want to weigh in on that? I know that's a touchy subject.
I mean, it's also, when you were talking about objectivity, when, you know, why I find this particular story regarding this AP journalist so interesting is because in so many ways it's very personal to her, obviously, but in so many ways it is a proxy for a very different conversation about cancel culture and the way in which the elephant in the room has been about what past statements people can make that they'll be held accountable for. And in her particular instance, my understanding of her comments were that they were not the objectively controversial statements that we've seen in other examples recently of cancel culture, where people are trying to say, hey, I have grown from this. I don't believe what I said before, and I've grown from this, and here's now what I think, and the ideas of allegations of cancel culture come in. Here's a relatively new graduate of a school, so you're not talking about the distance and then a change of heart or about face about what she said about her issue, but whatever the issue she was raising. And so when I think about this, it speaks to the idea of the elephant in the room, which is that people don't believe that journalists are objective. They believe that it is a partisan exercise in all opinion forms. The idea that every journalist becomes a pundit and there's a blurred line between what information they're providing and whether they're trying to influence or inform. And I think that stories like this, among others, are a part of that conversation, because it's so muddled in the sense of, is this a discussion about whether someone can have an opinion generally? Is it a discussion about a nebulous social media policy that allows an organization to selectively enforce it or have some basis to say, I don't have to give you a reason why this counts, but this does not? Or is it a discussion that is in reaction to, we as an industry don't want to be perceived as being partisan or influencing rather than informing? And I think that this is part of why this story is gaining so much traction, and I think should have the conversation, because we, as you know, before I was a journalist, just a few years ago, I'm an audience, I'm a consumer of news. And how I view the news is that I recognize that I'm going to look at some things for confirmation bias, right? I want to be a member of the choir that's preached to on areas I feel strongly about. Then again, I want to have both sides to understand the issues where I need to have the parameters to understand, God, what is my opinion on this? I want to have the facts, and then I'll be able to reconcile it in some way, shape, or form. But then you've got the idea of people looking at filters and only deciding to go to certain news organizations or news sources or social media as a citizen journalist. And they will only be receptive to the filters that they have put in place for themselves. And how do you, as a society, how do we as a globe then, if we're battling about what the facts are or what the truth is, not in terms of the substance, but on who is telling it to you, the conversations like what happened to this journalist are going to keep happening and keep having these things that have the chilling effect. Because I mean, when I was in college, I had no idea that I was going to be a journalist. It wasn't on my radar. It wasn't what I was thinking I was going to do at all. So any activity, any conversations to have it be held accountable down the road is one that I'm sure students are thinking about now, but we didn't have social, I feel so old. I have on my orange, but I feel so old. We didn't have the social media. Facebook was literally a book that they handed out to people every year, and you saw who your classmates were. And then Zuckerberg had this whole like digital things. That's how old I am. But when you think about how to anticipate the world, to your question, Kimbriell, how the world will react, it's so volatile, but it comes back to the fundamental question of, are you going to be held accountable for delivering the facts, or are you going to be held accountable by perceptions of bias? Where do you go?
That's an excellent question. And I'm going to get a couple other thoughts because I know Maria has been like just ready to pounce on this, and I'm going to go to Natalie after that. Maria, what are your thoughts?
I mean, my gosh, so many cool things. And again, I think in threes, right? So on objectivity, can we just say, I mean, even when I was with CNN in the 90s, I used to say objectivity is a myth, right? The fact that I replaced a waspy guy, 6'2", I'm 5'2", that changed our perspective. I'm Asian American, he was a wasp. And so our reports were different. The stories we chose were different, right? Hello, right? So that's the empire. And the easy way to do that is I would just talk about a room. If I was speaking in a room, and I would describe it from where I stood versus where the person in the back of the room, what the way they would describe it. And what makes a good news story is if you describe it from different parts, but then you give the whys. Why are we all in the room? And what are the colors given the blinders we have? So that's the first, objectivity. Let's blow it away. The second, even back then before social media, I actually said bias is in the eye of the beholder, because you can just go to that middle line, even about terrorism. One man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorism. And let's say we hit that line. Well, they can still interpret it two ways. And I think the third part is about organizations. And how I'm a news manager. I managed a large news group. I handled Southeast Asia for CNN. I now run, I help create, and I'm running a news organization under attack because we tell the truth, right? So, and truth, I would say, are facts. How many people are on this panel? There are 5 women. I mean, they're women, right? So that last part, when you are the organization, please don't use outdated notions. I feel like the world has changed dramatically. We are on quicksand, and our reporters are expected to go out in the field and in that quicksand, put themselves on the line, have the courage to put themselves on the line. And those definitions are going to have to shift, because to pretend like you will not have a past, to pretend that you will not have an opinion, right? Because anyone can have an opinion. That's part of the reporter's freedom of speech, freedom of expression. But I think where where it shifts into the organizational problem is when standards and ethics are violated. So what are the standards and ethics? And I think that goes down to, in this day and age, this is kind of what we use in Rappler now, is radical transparency. So let's go back to that room that you're describing for everyone. You tell everyone exactly where you're sitting in the room, why you're there. And it's a constant struggle. And it's really hard to manage a news group nowadays, because you have to keep all of that, all of the different stakeholders happy. I'll say the last thing is, in terms of social media, and I sound like a broken record, I'm sorry, Kimbriell, but part of the problem is when it gets shoved to journalists, right? So for example, if you report that there is much more, there are many more lies coming from the conservative side versus liberal, that's in the US. Here in the Philippines, it would be more lies on the Duterte camp than the opposition politicians. That's a fact, but you will get attacked anyway, and the cognitive bias of the people who are reading or watching will determine that. So how do you fix it? Back to the tech. We have to go back, because in the end, people are being manipulated, our worldviews are getting changed, and trust is being torn apart.
So Natalie, I want to get you in here, and then afterwards we're going to pivot to, now that we've heard all this, what do we do going into the future? But Natalie, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think, part of, and I've been looking at the Q&A as well, and there's been some specific questions about, the New York Times in particular, kind of trying to sell a narrative. And I think that's wrong. And I think that's wrong from my own experience and from my experience with my colleagues. But I guess I would say that it is understandable to me as a reporter looking at the world. It's to me understandable how difficult it is to look at reporting and not see a narrative coming out of it. And the reason for that is that, we have, often our jobs are kind of to challenge people in power. We're not your best friend. We're not going to cover when planes take off. We're going to cover when planes crash. This is our job. Our job is to ask tough questions. Our job is to really kind of, and I'm in Mexico right now. I did literally cover plane crash for a year, but that often puts you in what is perceived to be direct conflict with those who are in power. And for us, though, it's not direct conflict. I don't view myself as in conflict with anyone. And if I'm seen as being viewed as in conflict with anyone or as pushing a specific narrative, that hurts my reporting and it makes me bad at my job. Because in my job, and I will speak to the New York Times in general, in the US as well, our job involves I'm assuming that the narrative that people think that we've pushed is somehow, anti the previous administration or something like that. The reality is that our reporters talk to more people in that administration probably than anybody else in the history of the United States. And in my job in Mexico, I have to be able to, and I enjoy talking to allies of the current administration, because, just because he's attacking journalists, that doesn't mean that it's going to affect the way that I cover the facts of what's happening on the ground. That being said, when the pandemic is being mismanaged in Mexico, we have to say that loudly and clearly. And so, we strive. Objectivity, for me, I can only speak for myself, is to be open to all sides of the story, to be talking to people on all sides of the story, to never attach yourself to one or the other side. Because the minute that you even start to go that way, you lose out on a whole other universe of facts, as Maria was saying. And so the way that we do our jobs most effectively, and the way that we tried, and I'm not saying we don't make mistakes, everybody makes mistakes, right? This is not some hubris of like, we're the voice of God here, right? But we strive every day, and I'm proud of the work that we do to do this, to maintain a list of sources and an inbox and a message, a WhatsApp inbox for me that is filled with people on both sides, where lobbyists on one side and lobbyists on the other are just as comfortable calling me to chat about what happened, and they believe that I'm going to take them seriously. And I think that is to me what objectivity is that in a story you remain open enough that all of your sources know that you are going to weigh the facts, not their opinions, but the facts that they give you, the same as you weigh on the other side. And that your story it's not, you don't just say these facts are these facts and these facts are these facts. You are pursuing the truth. And sometimes that means saying this thing happened. And sometimes that means your sources on one side are going to be pissed off. And I'm not even talking about a specific side, one side will always be pissed off if it is a hard truth. But I do think that all of us here on this panel and my colleagues at the Times strive for that level of objectivity in everything that we do. Otherwise, we're not doing our jobs. And we, need to be able to effectively operate even in scenarios where the question of the truth and the question of who gets to tell it is this matter of furious debate.
I was going to say, what I find so intriguing about what you said, Natalie, and it's fascinating to hear, because so in some ways I still feel like a consumer of journalism, where I'm learning behind the veil how it actually operates. And while you're talking about sourcing, I wonder if the readers and the audience is able to understand that how you have approached and come to it, because so many people, from the reasons that Sarah and Maria and Melanie have been talking about, make the journalist the story and attack the credibility, therefore they can't see it. And maybe it's the lawyer in me, and I'd love to hear Sarah too on this, because I know you cover the Supreme Court. A part of this just is fascinating. If you take it out of the context of the law, of journalism, it's almost like the wink and nod moment that everyone thinks is happening at a confirmation hearing of a Supreme Court justice, right? When you ask them questions about their opinion about a hotly contested issue, and they say, I'm going to review all the case data in front of me, and I'm not going to show I would never endeavor to at all tell you that I have made up my mind. I've written 42 law review articles on said issue, and I've told people in every paid speech, but I would never do this right now, whatever issue it might be, contentious or otherwise. And I feel like in some ways, the way that we approach Supreme Court confirmation hearings, where everyone says, you've got an opinion, but you have to be confirmed, and then you'll do what you want. The Bobby Brown, it's my prerogative notion. And we know that for life. So we'll pretend to play along for a second. And that's how old I am. The Bobby Brown, my prerogative, came to mind before any other song just now. Thank you very much. But the other aspect of it is, when it comes to journalism, people go, no, you can't possibly be told you can compartmentalize your personal views in the way you provide information. A Supreme Court justice, life tenure for a variety of things that will hold the weight of congressional decisions and everything else in the Constitution in our hands, fine. A journalist being able to report in the day-to-day, impossible to compartmentalize, and they become the story. I just find that such a fascinating, juxtaposition about the way people view one form of the highest form, I think, in the United States of perceived objectivity, and journalists who somehow they think can never get there.
Totally, Laura. The thing I always think about in the context of confirmation hearings is like, I do wonder, like, what if Supreme Court nominees just started being like, yeah, like I don't know, yeah, I did write that article, or like I've been a judge this whole time, like being opinionated is kind of part of the job. Like, I like, because I almost like the way I think about it in the context of journalism is like, that admission, it lets you get to the next step, like kind of what Maria is saying about transparency, like showing the work of reporting, like it, because part of your job is like, I'm going to give you the facts, here's what is the truth and what I think, what we have discerned happened. But part of it, I think journalists can honestly do a better job, I think, overall. And I think in the Trump era, we've started to collectively do a better job of showing the work that went into, discerning all these facts. Like and in the context of radio and podcasting, like, I don't think it's a coincidence that podcasts have been able to grow in the way that they have in the last several years and build trust, honestly, in the way that they have, because literally you're hearing the voices of, there is something very powerful about just like hearing the reporter's voice and like hearing the conversations that they're having with the people that they're interviewing, rather than just hearing sort of the facts that emerge at the end. It's like there is something, every time that as a news consumer, I've seen like sort of any kind of behind the scenes look at how a reporter did their storytelling, or even just like, Natalie, the very simple fact of you mentioning like, oh yeah, like I talk to people in the current government all the time. Like, there are just like very subtle admissions like that. Oh yeah, sorry, I feel like I'm going on too long, but there are very subtle admissions like that that I think are really powerful.
I hate to cut you off. So we have this robust discussion. We have one panelist who has to leave, but I want to get her in for one last question as we wrap this up. We talked about a lot today, but Melanie has to pop off. But how has all of what we talked about today going to impact our future as we define what news is and who gets to tell it?
Boy, I would be worth a lot of money if I could tell you that. That's a real crystal ball kind of moment. But, I think we regularly bury journalism. We decide that it's dead, that it's no longer working, that it's this and that. I work on a local level, and what that means in so many ways is even while people are screaming, about how biased we are and we're all fake news and this and that, when they get into trouble, when they need something, that's still the one place you come to ask for help, to ask for your truth to be explained, your side of the story. And I think that ultimately the job that we do has obviously changed. It is much more influenced, and I'm going to go back to Maria about this, by technology in several ways, including the fact that now viewers can directly talk to you through social media, or they can criticize you. In some cases, your company or your bosses will say, look at all of these texts that we're getting, and look at all of these emails and comments on Twitter that we're getting about your story. And if it's negative, they're very sensitive. And if it's positive, you run a commercial about it. But I think the future is always, there's always going to be a need for journalism. And in whatever form and by whomever is doing it, perhaps a lot more citizen journalism, but there will always be a need for people to be able to hear the story, the full story. And what we've got to do is just keep going forward, one foot in front of the other. It's really it. Maria.
Thank you, Melanie, for being with us today. Thank you so much. And we're just going to do one last, as Melanie departs us, we're just
great conversation.
I know, we need to have more of these. So with the leading 3 minutes that I have left, I'm going to ask the remaining 4 panelists for the last word, the last sentence, because I think we brought up so many things today: reporter safety, the death of reporters, reporting reputation, the work and being challenged and taken by the Department of Justice, the industry imploding, multiple platform, who's a journalist, who's not a journalist. That's a lot to take on. What's next, and how can we make this a better industry? How can we help things moving forward? Sarah, I'll start with you.
Sure. Yeah. I think that news consumers are smart, and I think that it's really powerful when journalists can admit what they know and what they don't know and show their work as much as they can, and just show the reporting, I think, and show their humanity as much as they can. I think it goes a long way.
Natalie, how about you?
I don't know. I mean, I think that what Sarah said is spot on. I think we need to find ways of connecting with our readers, of our listeners, of our viewers more directly, of explaining the work that we do. And that happens, with sources with who are also readers. That happens in personal discussions, that happens in places like this. But if we can try to be as transparent about the way that we produce our work and our stories, and the way that we report out the facts and reach a specific story. I think even here, I'm sure that I know that hearing all of how all of you do your work and hearing from different parts of the world has given me a new perspective about how this happens. And so as much as we can do that, I think we can try to break through what is some of this distrust that has been built up over time.
Great. Maria, then Laura.
I began my career covering the movement of democracy through the shift to democracy from authoritarian one-man rule in Southeast Asia and Asia. Now, the end of my career, I'm covering the rise of dictators and the coronavirus has helped that. So I think in general, journalists have held the line, right? I see this in every country around the world, from like Orban, Erdogan, to Duterte in the Philippines. I could go to jail for the rest of my life. So the first is the journalists hold tight. Like Melanie said, we just got to keep going. I think that the solution is in three. The first is tech. Put some guardrails on those tech. And you guys watching from Princeton, you're very powerful. Some of you are in those tech companies. Stop the scorched earth policy. Don't make that much money. Moderate the greed and protect our democracy and the facts. The second is investigative journalism has to survive, has to thrive. Great to hear from Natalie and the other people on this panel. And the third part is the connection. These are the three concentric circles of Rappler: tech, journalism, investigative journalism. And the third is community. The community needs to come together, right? But in our elevator pitch in 2012, it was, we build communities of action, and the food we feed our communities is journalism. If people do not have shared facts, we don't have anything. We cannot move forward. We don't have a shared reality. So please work with us to fix it.
Laura, the last word on this? Oh, unmute.
It's been a year and I still don't know how to use Zoom. The press has got to be nimble, objective, credible, and they've got to strive to inform before they influence. And the nations around the world have to understand the very important, valuable, symbiotic relationship. We need the press, we need the truth, and I hope we all get it.
This has been an incredible session. Thank you so much for the passion, the thought, and the discussion that we've had today. Melanie, Natalie, Sarah, Laura, and Maria, this has been incredible. So thank you. Thank also our audience for participating and answering these wonderful, thoughtful questions. We got to as many as we could, but obviously this is an ongoing discussion. Stick around at the end of the panel for a sneak peek of a new 9-part video series produced by Princeton University's Office of Communication for YouTube called Forward Thinkers. The 1-minute video features a number of the faculty thinkers who appear in the series, and the first video is available now, featuring macro scale energy systems engineer Jesse Jenkins, and that is on YouTube. Thank you again for everybody for being here, and have a successful meeting. Thanks all.
We have this pretty huge question. We want to know how the universe began.
It's a great adventure to try to figure out what life is.
The really big remaining question in my fields is how the immune system works.
There are all these classicists from the 19th and early 20th centuries who are African American. Why aren't they studied?
Climate change has been accelerating, and it's going to get worse unless we do something now.
Diseases, for example, Alzheimer's.
The question of looted art is global.
There are entire classes of problems that we've just given up as impossible that suddenly might be things that can be solved.
The opportunities for bettering humanity are limitless.
And I said, oh my God, this is the topic we need to work on.
This is my turf.
It might be something that would lead to an entire paradigm shift in our understanding of physics.
I think what's going to happen will have an impact on every one of our lives.
It sounds impossible, but we've done this in the lab.
I'm a forward thinker.
I'm a forward thinker.
I'm a forward thinker.